The orphan boy had been holding the crumpled photograph in his pocket for 3 days. He was 8 years old, his name was Caleb, and he had been told not to bring it onto the Family Feud stage. But when Steve Harvey knelt beside him and asked, "What you got in your pocket, young man?" Caleb pulled it out anyway. It was an old photograph of a little girl standing beside a smiling man in a blue work shirt. The edges were torn. Someone had folded it so many times that a white crease ran straight through the middle. Steve opened it, looked at the picture, and asked, "Who are these people?" Caleb whispered, "My mom and dad." Then he pointed at the little girl. "That's me." Steve looked at the photograph again. Then Caleb said 6 words that silenced the entire studio. "I don't remember their voices anymore." Steve slowly lowered the photograph. He stopped the game. He walked to the center of the stage. And what he did next left the entire audience in tears. The photograph was small enough to fit inside Caleb Morgan's palm. It had been taken 9 years earlier. Caleb wasn't even born yet. His mother was holding a little girl. His father stood beside her. They were smiling. They looked happy. They looked like a family that believed they had all the time in the world. They didn't know the photograph would one day become the only thing Caleb had left. It was April 4th, 2026, at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. The audience was already laughing. The lights were bright. The music was loud. Steve Harvey stood between 2 families, joking with the contestants. Caleb stood at the end of his family's line. He was 8, small for his age. Quiet, he wore a navy blue sweater and black sneakers. His Aunt Maria stood beside him. She had become his legal guardian 6 months earlier. She kept looking at Caleb. "Everything okay?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah," but his right hand was inside his pocket. His fingers were wrapped around the photograph. He had been holding it since breakfast. Maria knew the photograph existed. She just didn't know Caleb had brought it. She had told him to leave it at home. "It's too fragile," she'd said. Caleb had nodded. Then he put it in his pocket anyway. Because there was something he needed to do, something he had been thinking about for weeks. Caleb had been an orphan since he was 7. His mother died first. Her name was Emily. She was 31. She had worked as a nurse at a small community hospital. She loved blueberry muffins. She hated thunderstorms. And every night before Caleb went to bed, she kissed his forehead and said the same thing. "Tomorrow is going to be a good day." Caleb believed her. Then one night Emily didn't come home. She had been driving home after a late shift when another vehicle crossed the center line. The accident happened less than 3 miles from their house. Caleb was asleep. He woke up the next morning expecting pancakes. Instead, his Aunt Maria was sitting on the edge of his bed. Her face was red. Her eyes were swollen. Caleb knew something was wrong. "Where's Mom?" Maria couldn't answer. Caleb asked again, "Where's Mom?" Maria pulled him into her arms. That was when he understood. Something had happened. Something terrible. His mother was gone. Caleb cried for 3 days. Then he stopped, not because he wasn't sad, because he had seen his aunt crying. He thought if he stopped crying, maybe she would stop too. 3 months later, his father died. His name was David. He had been sick for years. Emily had always said he was getting stronger, but after she died, he stopped fighting. He had a heart attack while driving to work. Caleb was 7 years old. Within 1 year, he had lost both parents. He moved into Maria's house. She had 2 children of her own. Suddenly, Caleb had a new bedroom, a new school, a new routine, a new family, but he had no mother to call, No father to ask questions, and no one who remembered exactly what his parents sounded like when they laughed. Maria tried. She showed him photographs, she played old videos, she told stories. Your dad used to dance while cooking. Caleb smiled. What kind of dancing? The terrible kind. He laughed. But later that night he asked, Aunt Maria? Yeah? What did Dad's voice sound like? Maria froze. She realized something. Caleb couldn't remember. He remembered his father's face, his hands, his blue work shirt. But the voice was fading. Then Caleb asked the question that broke her heart. What if I forget Mom too? Maria pulled him close. You won't, but privately she wasn't sure. That was why the photograph mattered. It was the last photograph Caleb had that showed all three of them, Emily, David, and Caleb as a baby. The original photograph had been stored inside an old box. Caleb found it after his father's funeral. He took it everywhere. He kept it under his pillow, then inside a school notebook, then inside his pocket. The corners became bent. The paper became soft. One afternoon it accidentally went through the washing machine. The colors faded. The middle tore. Maria offered to replace it. Caleb refused. No, Caleb, I can print another copy. It won't be the same. She didn't argue. He was right. The photograph wasn't valuable because it was rare. It was valuable because it was his. The only thing in the world that showed him what his family looked like before everything changed. Months later, Maria applied for Family Feud. She thought it might give Caleb something happy to remember. When the family got selected, Caleb was thrilled. Steve Harvey? Maria laughed. Yes, I'm going to meet him. Yes, does he really make people laugh? Yes, Caleb smiled. Mom would like him. Maria looked away. Yeah, she liked that show. I know. Caleb had seen old episodes with her. He remembered sitting beside his mother on the couch. He remembered her laughing. But he couldn't remember the sound of her laugh. That bothered him more than anything. The night before the taping, Caleb took the photograph out of his drawer. He looked at it. His father was smiling. His mother was smiling. Baby Caleb was asleep in her arms. He whispered, I remember your faces. Then he touched the photograph. I just don't remember your voices. He folded it, put it in his pocket, and went to sleep. The next morning, Maria noticed it. You brought the picture? Caleb nodded. I told you to leave it home. I know. Why did you bring it? Caleb looked at her. I need Steve to see it. Maria sighed. Okay, she didn't ask why. Maybe she already knew. The family arrived at the studio. Caleb watched the cameras. He watched the lights. He watched Steve. When Steve came onto the stage, Caleb smiled. Steve immediately noticed him. Look at this little man. The audience laughed. Steve walked over. What you got, buddy? Caleb smiled. Nothing, Steve laughed. That's the wrong answer. Everybody got something. Caleb laughed. The first round began. Caleb's family played well. He answered a question. He got it right. Steve gave him a high five. That's what I'm talking about. Caleb smiled. For a few minutes, he forgot everything. He was just an 8-year-old kid on television. Then Steve came back toward him. He noticed Caleb's hand inside his pocket. You hiding something from me? Caleb froze. The audience laughed. Steve pointed. What's in that pocket? Caleb looked at Maria. She nodded slowly. Caleb reached inside. He pulled out the photograph. It was folded, crumpled, soft from being handled too many times. Steve's expression changed. What's that? Caleb held it out. For you. Steve took it. He carefully unfolded the paper. The first thing he saw was the little girl. Then the man beside her. Then the baby. Steve looked at Caleb. Who's this? My mom. Steve pointed. And this? My dad. Then he pointed at the baby. That's you? Caleb nodded. Steve smiled. That's a beautiful picture. Caleb stared at the floor. Steve noticed. What happened? Caleb took a breath. My mom died. Steve's smile disappeared. My dad too. Steve looked down at the photograph. How long ago? My mom died when I was 7, and your dad? Later that year. Steve slowly nodded. He held the photograph with both hands. Then Caleb whispered, I don't remember their voices anymore. The studio went silent. Steve stopped moving. He looked at Caleb, then at the photograph, then back at Caleb. The smile was completely gone. Steve took off his glasses. He looked toward the floor. For several seconds he didn't speak. The audience became completely still. Steve finally looked up. How old were you? 7, Steve nodded. 7, Caleb nodded. Steve's voice became quieter. That's a lot for a little boy. Caleb looked at him. I try to remember. Steve swallowed. What do you remember? My mom sang. Steve smiled gently. What did she sing? I don't know. Caleb's eyes filled. I forgot. Steve looked away. His jaw tightened. He took a slow breath. Then he walked toward Caleb. He knelt. Come here. Caleb stepped forward. Steve hugged him. The audience began crying. Caleb whispered into Steve's shoulder, I don't want to forget them. Steve closed his eyes. You won't. Caleb pulled back. How do you know? Steve looked directly at him. Because you keep their story alive. Caleb shook his head. But I can't remember their voices. Steve nodded. That's okay. He tapped the photograph. You remember this. Caleb looked down. Steve continued. You remember what they looked like. Caleb nodded. You remember that they loved you. Another nod, and you remember enough to tell their story. Caleb's eyes filled again. Steve stood. Then he turned toward the production booth. Stop the game. The audience fell silent. Steve placed the photograph carefully on the podium. We're not doing this right now. A producer spoke into his headset. Steve shook his head. No, he looked at Caleb. This little man doesn't need to win a game today. He looked toward Maria. He needs his family. Maria began crying. Steve walked over. He took her hand. How long has he been with you? 6 months. Steve nodded. And you've been doing this by yourself? Maria shook her head. My husband helps. Steve smiled. Good, then he looked at Caleb. You know what your aunt did? Caleb shook his head. She gave you a home when you lost yours. Caleb looked at Maria. Then he hugged her. Maria broke down. Steve stepped back. The audience stood. No applause. Just silence. Steve looked toward the camera. Sometimes people think being an orphan means nobody loves you. He shook his head. That's not what it means. He pointed toward Maria. Sometimes it means somebody else decides to love you when they didn't have to. Maria wiped her face. Steve walked back toward Caleb. Do you know what your mom would want? Caleb shook his head. Steve smiled. She'd want you to laugh. Caleb smiled slightly. She'd want you to play. Another small smile. And she'd want you to stop carrying this picture like it's the only thing you have. Caleb looked down. Steve gently touched the photograph. You've got people now. Then Steve reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. I need to make a call. He dialed. Robert? He waited. I need a family support package. Pause. An 8-year-old boy lost both parents. He looked at Caleb. He's with his aunt now. Steve listened. I want $50,000 placed into an education and family support fund for him. Maria immediately shook her head. Steve, that's too much. Steve covered the phone. No, He looked at her. It's not. He returned to the call. And I want professional grief counseling for Caleb. Pause, not just one appointment, long term. He ended the call. The audience applauded. Steve raised his hand. That's not a prize. He looked at Maria. That's for his future. Then Steve turned toward the opposing family. Their captain, James, stepped forward. He looked at Caleb, then at his own family. We don't want to play anymore. Steve shook his head. You came here to play. James said we came here as strangers. He looked at Caleb. We don't feel like strangers now. The audience erupted. Steve smiled. Both families get the prize. The applause became louder. Caleb looked confused. Steve laughed. You still get to say you won. Caleb smiled. Really? Really? Steve held out his hand. Caleb took it. Then Steve did something nobody expected. He picked up the crumpled photograph. He carefully unfolded it. He looked at it one more time. Then he said, "This shouldn't live in your pocket anymore." Caleb looked worried. Why? Because we're going to protect it. Steve turned toward the production team. I want this professionally restored. Caleb's eyes widened. You can do that? Steve smiled. We're going to try. Then Steve pointed toward the camera. And we're going to make copies. Caleb stared at him. One for your aunt. Another point. One for your room. Another, one for your school. Caleb laughed. Why school? So everybody knows what your parents looked like. Caleb smiled. Steve handed him the original. Never forget this. Caleb took it. Then Steve added, but don't be afraid to make new pictures too. That sentence made Maria cry again. Steve walked away. Then he stopped. He turned back. Caleb, yeah? Take a picture with me. Caleb smiled. Steve knelt beside him. The photographer raised the camera. Caleb held the old photograph. Steve put one hand on his shoulder. Click. That photograph became the first new picture Caleb had of his life after losing his parents. 3 weeks later, the episode aired. The moment Steve unfolded the photograph spread across social media. Within 24 hours, more than 12 million people had seen the clip. Within a month, more than 80 million. But the most powerful reaction wasn't the view count. It was the stories. Adults began posting photographs of parents they had lost. People shared pictures of grandparents. Children shared pictures of siblings. One woman wrote, I don't remember my mother's voice either. Thank you for reminding me that forgetting one detail doesn't mean forgetting the person. Another wrote, my father died when I was 6. I have one photograph left. The story became bigger than the show. 6 months later, Caleb's restored photograph arrived. It was beautiful. The colors were clearer. The tear through the middle was repaired. The faces were sharper, but Caleb refused to throw away the original. He kept both. The restored version went into a frame. The damaged original went into a small wooden box. Inside the box were 3 things. The photograph, his mother's old recipe card for blueberry muffins, and a note from his father. 3 things Caleb could touch when he missed them. A year later, Caleb asked Maria a question. Can we make a video? Of what? Of Mom and Dad. Maria nodded. They collected every photograph, every home video, every old voicemail, every birthday recording. They put them together. For the first time, Caleb heard his mother's voice again. It wasn't clear. It wasn't long. But it was there. His mother's voice saying, Happy birthday, baby. Caleb froze. He listened again. Then again. He started crying. Maria hugged him. Caleb whispered, I remember. 2 years after the Family Feud episode, Caleb created a small project at his school called the Memory Box. Children could bring photographs, letters, drawings, or recordings of loved ones they had lost. They could write down stories. They could preserve voices. They could create new memories. The project started with 7 children. Within 2 years, more than 300 families participated. Caleb's message was simple. You don't have to remember everything to remember someone. 5 years after that family feud stage, Caleb was 13. He had grown taller. He played basketball, he still loved blueberry muffins, and he still had the photograph. One afternoon, Steve received a letter. It was written in careful handwriting. Dear Mr. Steve, you asked me to make new pictures. I did. I have hundreds now, but I still keep the old one. I don't remember everything about Mom and Dad, but I remember that they loved me. Thank you for helping me keep that. Steve read the letter twice. Then he called Maria. She handed the phone to Caleb. Steve said, "What's up, young man?" Caleb laughed. "I'm not little anymore." Steve laughed. "That's what everybody says." Caleb asked, "Do you still have the picture?" Steve paused. "Yeah, you kept it?" Steve smiled. "Of course." Caleb was quiet. Then he said, "I got the restored one." Steve laughed. "Good." There was a pause. Then Caleb said, "I remember Mom's voice now." Steve became quiet. "That's good. She used to sing terribly." Steve laughed. "That's even better." Caleb laughed. And for the first time there was no sadness in the silence between them. Only memory, only life. The crumpled photograph had started as something Caleb carried because he was afraid of forgetting. But eventually it became something else. Proof that his parents existed. Proof that he had been loved. Proof that even after losing everything, a child could still build a future. The Family Feud episode ended without a final score. There was no dramatic victory, no buzzer, no championship moment. There was only an 8-year-old boy holding a photograph, and a man who understood that sometimes a child doesn't need another prize. Sometimes he needs someone to look at the picture with him and say, "I see them. I see you." And you don't have to remember everything alone. Because photographs don't just preserve faces, sometimes they preserve the pieces of us that grief tries to take away. A voice, a smile, a hand, a kitchen, a Sunday morning, a life. Caleb thought he had brought Steve Harvey a crumpled photograph. What he really brought him was a question. What happens when I forget? Steve's answer wasn't complicated. You make new memories. You tell their stories. You keep their pictures. And you keep living. Because remembering someone isn't about holding on to the past so tightly that you stop moving forward. It's about carrying the love forward with you. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for an orphan child isn't to tell him that everything will be okay. It's to sit beside him, look at the photograph, and let him know they were here. They loved you. And you are still here too. If this story about Caleb and his crumpled photograph touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who has lost a loved one and still keeps an old photograph close. Have you ever held onto a picture because it reminded you of someone you couldn't bear to forget? Tell us your story in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more stories about family, love, loss, and the moments that remind us we're never truly alone.